I am Miriam and Sarah of Massachusetts Peace Action, and we are here this evening to discuss two critical topics for understanding the state of the world: the rise of authoritarianism and hyper-imperialism. And to do so, we have turned to Vijay Prashad, whose Tricontinental Institute has recently published 3 important articles on the topic, and I dare say that he might be one of the best people to ask about these issues at this particular moment. Not just him, but the whole Tricontinental Institute team, which covers a number of continents. We're going to put those articles in the chat so that you can read them at your leisure, of course. And we've also asked Brian Garvey, Assistant Director, soon to be Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action, and who also has a standing interest in these topics, to serve as interlocutor, initiating the questions and guiding the dialogue that will unfold, first with Brian and Vijay, and then with all of you, the audience. So more about Vijay and Brian, though they may need very little introduction. I'm going to do it anyway. Vijay Prashad is Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute. He's an Indian-born historian and journalist currently living in the Global South. He's the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and The Fragility of U.S. Power, written with Noam Chomsky, as was his latest book in 2024, On Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle. Prashad is the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, an independent international news syndication service for the people of the Global South, though thoroughly accessible to us and may be of interest, and the chief editor of Leftward Books of New Delhi. Brian Garvey is the incoming executive director of Massachusetts Peace Action. Brian served as assistant director for 5 years after joining MAPA as a volunteer. He initially joined MAPA's protests of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's red carpet treatment at MIT and Harvard, you might remember, even as he pursued a criminal bombing campaign in Yemen. That was Salman, not needless to say. As assistant director, Brian co-led the Raytheon anti-war campaign, the National Yemen Peace Coalition, the War Industry Resistors Network, and the Twin Existential Threats Climate and Nuclear Disarmament United campaign. He has also led MAPA's communications, fundraising, and internship programs for the past year to 2 years. An interesting note, Brian was part of last week's convention in the streets in Chicago, and with Keith Harvey of New England AFSC and Lee Stevens, MAPA intern, set up a 75-yard banner that throughout its length displayed the extent of the U.S. military budget in contrast to both domestic spending and the military budgets of other nations. It took 75 yards. And he will be presenting on, he and Keith Harvey will be presenting on their experiences in Chicago next week. Stay tuned. A word on the format for this evening. Brian will pose questions on the two topics in sequence. Vijay will answer these initial questions in 5 to 7 minutes each. Brian may have follow-up questions to pose to Vijay, but by 7:30, we should be able to open the floor for questions from the audience. We can continue the discussion until around 8:15, or as long as Vijay can stay with us, and you as well. So let me turn it over to Brian.
Well, thanks, Mary, for the kind introduction and for laying out the format. As Mary said, we're looking forward to hearing from all of you as well. So please do take note of your questions as they occur to you. And we're going to let you, the audience, run the show for the second half of our program. But let me say welcome to Vijay Prashad, and thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah. Having me back. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. First of all, 40 books.
And oh, wait a minute. Congratulations on being the next executive director. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you'll do a great job. You have some shoes to fill, but you'll do a great job.
I have some serious big shoes to fill. You're right about that. But as a grassroots peace organization, we all come together and make the work happen. That's the great thing about being in a grassroots organization. But I want to get right into the subject matter of tonight, which is very serious. The threat of authoritarianism and hyper-imperialism. So my first question for you is on authoritarianism. I think we can all agree that we are seeing a rise of fundamentalism and authoritarianism in the world today. It's been going on for at least a few decades. We're seeing it all over the world, in politics and culture and society at large. We're seeing it with Mr. Trump, who is seeking re-election and talking about, how he'd like to be a dictator. We're seeing it with the threat of Project 2025, which lays out a path towards authoritarianism in the United States. And we're seeing it around the world in countries like Hungary with Viktor Orban, with Mr. Modi in India. Mary already mentioned Crown Prince MBS in Saudi Arabia. That's been an authoritarian country for quite some time. But we want to get your opinion, Vijay, on what do you think is fueling this increased drive towards authoritarianism across the world, and especially why members of the working class, who should not be supportive of authoritarianism, seem to be susceptible to that message.
Yeah, so Brian, the first thing is that the concept of authoritarianism, I think, needs to be really thought about. It became popular in the 1950s with the publication of Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. You began to see this argument being made that communism and fascism are both species of totalitarianism or authoritarianism. And the antidote for these two different forms of so-called totalitarianism or authoritarianism is liberalism, is, American-style liberal democracy. That was the argument in Hannah Arendt's considerable book in 1951. The United States had a big propaganda effort to say that the US and the Europeans were the upholders of freedom, and everything on the other side of the so-called Iron Curtain was unfreedom. This was the narrative coming from the United States. We get a similar kind of narrative today. And, I'm a little cautious about some of this stuff because, after all, we've got a different scenario. We have a different world we are living in. And so we need to understand and drill deep into this question. What is the concept that's most appropriate? At Tricontinental, we are not actually, we don't believe that this is an era of fascism or authoritarianism. We have a slightly different approach. And the reason is that we want to really look at the facts. We don't want to use the word fascism like a slogan, just in a moral way. Trump is a fascist. This one is a fascist. I like yelling that at demonstrations. You're a fascist, or putting it up on a sign, but it might not be the most accurate analysis in order to create strategies and tactics. So, we got to build the theory of what is happening from the facts. And what one finds is that there is a far right of a new type. And we released 10 theses on the far right of a new type, in which we talk about the fact that under this situation of capitalism, there is a real, disarticulation of the possibility of trade unions. Precarious labor has made it very hard to build trade unions. Look at the United States as an example. One celebrates when one Amazon sorting place is organized. It becomes a great celebration. Chris Smalls becomes an important figure in the US left. But that was one Amazon center. There are 1,000 of them. Very hard to organize these, very hard to organize Uber Eats drivers or Uber drivers and so on, difficult enough to organize these precarious workers. And then there's day laborers and whatnot. So there's a great disarticulation of the working class. Working class culture has deteriorated for a very long time. The kind of community support structures and so on, at the same time as the state has cut drastically social welfare programs. And so this situation has created distress, but also a kind of loneliness, a kind of desire for community, a loss of meaning in the world. And we believe, from our analyses in various countries, in Brazil, we did a deep dive into all this, but we believe that the root of the far right of a special type is in this social distress, this kind of existential loneliness. But at the same time, this far right of a special type is not interested in really doing a coup d'etat. I mean, January 6th is not a serious endeavor. They are quite happy to win through the established institutions. Liberal institutions allow them enormous latitude. And once they come to power, these forces, the repressive apparatus is available for them. You don't need a Trump to repress people on the streets. Obama was doing similar things. The apparatus exists. There's legal latitude for the police to shoot somebody and say, well, it was in the line of duty. One person, I don't remember the statistic, but 3 people a day, I think, shot in the United States by the police. This is not just under the far right of a special type. This is even under liberals. So the liberal institutions give latitude to these forces to come to power. And now the interesting thing is putting these 2 points together, this sort of existential crisis amongst working class people, and then this far right that says, well, we'll use the liberal institutions as far as they go. The problem is that liberals have in fact compromised their own ideological position. There is no social democratic culture in liberalism any longer. They are the ones who are doing the cutbacks, the cutting of labor, working, union rights and so on, producing the ground for this real precariousness. They are the ones who quite happily put more money into military spending and so on. So we come in with a concept called the intimate embrace between liberalism and the far right of a special type. The reason this is really important is it allows us to think about strategy and tactics, because if you fall for the liberal scream that the fascists are at the gates and we are the only antidote to them, then you will basically elect a liberal, and the liberal would set the ground for more distress, which is going to drive the far right to much more radicalism. So in the United States, for instance, you're stuck in an election year between the intimate embrace between liberals and the far right. Neither is going to provide an antidote for each other because they are 2 faces of the same thing. So when it comes to so-called authoritarianism, we want to piece this down, because that term has been used more than you'd imagine to attack the left, really, in calling the left authoritarian. I mean, to call, for instance, this or that left leader an authoritarian around the world, the Cuban Revolution, Nicolas Maduro, etc., the Chinese government, all of them being called authoritarian, whereas somehow it insulates this sort of neoliberal compact that the liberals have made, which has compromised their ability to produce a rich democratic culture in their own society. So this is how we approach the question of authoritarianism, Brian. It's not some sort of outlier. It, in fact, emerges from the very ground of the politics of liberalism.
Yes, and I think it makes sense. It's very appealing for those with power to want to consolidate it and maintain it, no matter what their ideology is, left, right, center, whatever ideology. There is that tendency, which is why in a stable, flourishing democracy, there are hopefully institutions, both inside and outside of government, that can prevent that can challenge it, that can keep it in check. Now, as you were saying, among the working class, especially here in this country, those systems have been in a way gutted. Can you talk about that a little bit and the organizing that needs to be done to replace them? Maybe not with the same things that existed in the 20th century, but different versions in the 21st century that can serve as checks against government power and authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, as far as I'm concerned, the most important element in the most important part of the antidote is to revive democratic cultures. The term democracy has been so eroded and destroyed. What makes the United States more a democracy than China? Is it just because there's an election? Is there really an election? I mean, is there really a democratic election? There are no political parties. The two major political parties, at least, are not political parties. They're election machines. I mean, when is the last time you heard of genuine neighborhood clubs of the Republican or Democratic Party where there's a culture of debate and dispute? When has the Democratic Party gone to the base to ask it to help write the convention document? I mean, I belong to a left-wing political party in India. When it comes to the Congress, it starts with a draft document put together by the center. Then that is sent to all the branches. Every branch reads it. Every branch debates it. We send amendments to the Congress. There's a rich, vibrant debate. And more often than not, the draft document is actually quite transformed by the time it comes into its final shape. Nothing like that happens in the Democratic or Republican Party. The document is written effectively as an election vehicle. It's written by consultants. It's written by the candidate. It's not written by even the people who are delegates to the convention. They just sit there and vote and cheer and so on. There really isn't a dispute and debate and a rich democratic culture. The political life in a country like the United States is totally eroded. What is called democracy is merely getting a chance to enter the loneliest place in the United States on election day, which is the voting booth. It's the loneliest place for people of the left because you're standing there, you know that you have no good choices. You end up wanting to vote for a third party. You either vote for, let's say, the Green Party, or you want to vote for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. You want to vote for Cornel West, say, this year. You really want to do that, but it's the loneliest place. And, I mean, even in this call where you've got pretty hardened people with great histories, I see Paki right in front of me, people sitting there in that loneliest place in America, and they decide, well, I can't afford to waste my vote. I'm going to vote Democratic. I'm in Pennsylvania. I mean, there is a kind of real attrition of what democracy means. If that is democracy, so much money wasted in the process, campaigns which are meaningless, the real issues not debated. How is that democratic? Meanwhile, of course, we think China's not democratic. Well, you should come and see what branch meetings are like. I mean, there's 100 million members of the Communist Party of China. They have vigorous meetings in their branches. There are neighborhood committees. They have an organized society. That's how, when COVID took place, there were people coming to your door all the time in China. I once asked somebody if in the United States, in the first year of the pandemic, did anybody knock on your door? Well, no. Did anybody from the government come and knock on your door? No, nobody came to check up on me. This is insane. Like, how was it that the government didn't have an entire cadre of people who went door to door saying, Mary, do you need anything? Can we get you groceries? Do you need us to get you medicines? There was no contact from the government. What kind of democracy is that? So the antidote is to try to revive democratic culture. This is not just about ideas. It's about doing things. And I know, I'm talking to the wrong state. This is Massachusetts, where most of you have incredibly rich and and quite beautiful collective cultures. You belong to this group and that group and so on, but you're still a minority, even in Massachusetts. I mean, in other states even less. So sometimes what substitutes for this are religious organizations, which are well organized. They exist. They have capacity, they have money, they're not threatening to the order, so people donate money to them. And religious organizations provide the kind of community function that a democratic society should provide. And that's, that's that. It exists. Marx called it the opium of the people. He meant opium as a tincture against pain, not like opium in a bad way. He said it's a tincture against pain. It's a little painkiller. Religion is. And indeed, in a society where the social fabric is withering, it does provide some assistance. Sometimes that comes with all kinds of ghastly political ideas, homophobia, sexism, and so on. Really dangerous political ideas. But, they are still out there trying to build some sort of community in a very frayed landscape. You can't build socialism without a society. That's pretty clear to me. And you can't build a democracy without having some sort of demos, without having some kind of social networks and so on. It just can't be done. You can't have a society that's democratic, which is built of families, individual families. Even Hegel, in his theory, said there are three important tiers in the construction of a robust modern state structure: the family, civil society, and the state. And in many respects, civil society is withered in the advanced industrial countries, some of it because it's been privatized and NGOized. Volunteer culture has withered. Capitalism has entered such a place in our brains that we don't want to do anything unless we're getting paid to do it. We see that as somehow, disrespect to ourselves, right? Mary, am I going to send you an invoice? This is my time. I'm working now. Are you going to pay me for this? I mean, is this a disrespect of me that I'm not getting paid? But this is how people think. They think that I deserve to be paid for whatever I do. And that creates, that abuses the idea of a society. Che Guevara, after the revolution in Cuba, made a big push of building volunteerism in order to rebuild social bonds, which had been destroyed previously. So, Brian, what is the antidote? Well, I don't have any immediate tactics for you. You come up with those. But if you don't build a society, you can't build anything.
And I will say that here in Massachusetts, we do have our problems. I enjoy living here, and it is, according to some indexes, one of the best places to live, also one of the most expensive as a result. But we still have problems. Our legislature here is incredibly opaque. We give massive amounts of money to Washington for the military budget every year, as I'm sure everyone here in Massachusetts knows. But what we're trying to do at Massachusetts Peace Action and at other peace action affiliates across the country is allowing people to participate, not just asking people to be passive, but asking people to volunteer, asking people to lead initiatives. And that's one thing that we see as an antidote. And it may not surprise you that our offices are in a church, because, as you were saying, that is one of the institutions of civil society that does still exist and isn't an obvious threat to the system. But as Mary is telling me in the chat, we got to keep moving. So I do want to get to our second topic before we open things up to the audience. That's always one of our favorite parts. And that is the threat of hyper-imperialism, which is something that we work on all the time. As we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, we're also witnessing a new form of hyper-imperialism. We see that in the United States as a way to maintain a unipolar world. As everyone here knows, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States declared itself as the one remaining superpower in the world and stated that it was its doctrine to maintain that. Now that we're seeing that, it's even coming at the expense of some of our EU allies who are facing economic struggles because of this. But as citizens and residents of the US largely, we don't really get the perspective of those who are living on the other end of US hyper-imperialism, let's say. You're calling us from South America right now. You're in Chile. You're originally from India, I believe. I'm wondering if you can share some of your perspective on how this effort to maintain control, the lone superpower status, looks from people in the global South and across the world, and also how folks see the rise of blocs to counter this. I'm talking about the BRICS movement, for instance. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Ethiopia, Iran, other countries. How do they see those countries as a challenge to U.S. hegemony?
Well, the most important thing to recognize is that some of this is a result of the contradictions of history. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States thought, oh, well, we are the superpower now, first among equals, not really equals, but pares inter pares and so on. Well, the US did two things that perhaps were, in retrospect, errors. One of the things that the United States did was started wars all over the world. I mean, a series of nonstop wars, which didn't work out so well. From the war against Panama, 1989, all the way out to the destruction of Libya, the attempt to overthrow the government in Syria, and so on. The sanctions, the unilateral illegal sanctions, which is a form of economic war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's one. Secondly, the United States basically welcomed the export of the productive forces through a process which we now know as globalization, where factories were put everywhere in the world and so on. This, by 2007, made some serious problems. The financial crisis took place. And at the time of the financial crisis, it became very clear that the United States government was not able to generate the kind of surpluses it had historically generated from 1945 till at least the 1980s. The big surpluses were not being generated by the US. Having exported its productive capacity around the world, the United States suddenly looked around the world and saw that the center of gravity of world production had shifted to Asia. China, India, Indonesia, several other countries were producing at a high clip rate and were exporting around the world high-tech goods, very, very good products, and so on, and that they were generating large surpluses. This was not happening in the United States. In China, there was consternation because there was the sense that, my God, we rely on the US market. What's going to happen now? So they had to pivot. And in pivoting, China, India, other countries tried new strategies. China went first to the One Belt, One Road strategy, expanding first into its western provinces and then into Central Asia. This became the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. India, China, Brazil, other big countries, again, worried about the sudden disappearance or saturation of the US market, turned to the South-South kind of initiatives, which included the formation of IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, eventually BRICS, with the addition of Russia and China. Now BRICS much more enlarged with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, in a kind of South-South trading configuration. The United States, seeing all this, reacted in a characteristic way. It had lost control of many aspects of the world, lost control of raw materials, having a monopoly over raw materials, lost control over science and technology. This was very important for the United States. Lost control as well over things like the productive capacity, the ability to produce more than other countries. These things had gone. In the United States today, if you're lucky riding the Acela, you can get to about 100 kilometers an hour if you're lucky. In China, the train between Beijing and Shanghai runs routinely at 340 kilometers an hour. That's a lot faster than 100 kilometers. In fact, when I was last in China, I saw the prototype of a train that will go at 600 kilometers an hour. It takes turns by the whole train bending. It's like something out of science fiction. It's pretty incredible. So they've gone ahead in terms of science and technology. You know, they are already building tools for 6G internet, not 4G. In parts of United States, you still have 3G tools. You look at your phone, it says 3G. Shouldn't say 3G anymore. Most of the world has gone beyond that. Even in India, people are at 5G, not 3G any longer. So the response that the United States made to this shift was in two different areas where it maintains control. One is in information. Elon Musk by himself owns more satellites than the Chinese government. That's just one guy and one company. Most undersea cables are privately held. The area of communications continues to be dominated by the West and its various allies. Second form of control was the military. We found in this text that I hope you look at on hyper-imperialism that the US actually spends 1.53 trillion a year on defense, not 900 billion. This is a wrong number. It's 1.53 trillion. 75% of global military spending is spent by the US, its NATO allies, and a couple of other NATO plus countries. 75%. Chinese spent 11% of the world's share of military budget, and Russia 4%. Who's the threat to the world? 75% versus 11 and 4. So the United States in this period, rather than compete with China commercially, why not build a better train than the Chinese, or build cheaper iPhones, or go out there and build other 5G technology, and so go and build tech and try to compete in the marketplace. They can't compete economically. They simply cannot. In fact, they tried to embargo chip production from Taiwan being sold into China and said, well, we're going to move our chip factory to Arizona, spent a lot of money building this factory under Biden's initiative, and the factory couldn't function because the Taiwanese scientists who came there said, the United States simply doesn't have the wherewithal to create the kind of these very fine chips that are being built in Taiwan and now in China. Compete with the rest of the world. Rather than compete, the US wants to use its military might to get these countries to surrender their economic advances. The United States openly has said, we have to stop the rise and advance of China. Why is China a threat to the US? There are no Chinese ships off the coast of San Francisco or off the coast of New York City. There are US ships threatening China's coastline. The Chinese want to trade with the world. They are not interested in a war. And they've said so openly on many occasions. They don't want to have a war with the US, but the US constantly trying to provoke a war, including Nancy Pelosi's ridiculous journey to Taiwan, big bravado going to Taiwan. And the Chinese were clever. They didn't do anything. They allowed the US, then Speaker of the House, to come in and to leave. And they just said, you do whatever you want, but we are not going to react to you. The United States recognizes that Taiwan is a part of China. That is there since the 1970s. That's a recognition. So why doesn't the US live up to that recognition? It's incredible when people talk about, well, Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a colony of the British. It had been seized during the Opium Wars by Britain from China and held until the lease ran out, and then they had to turn their colony back to the Chinese. So people said, well, democracy in Hong Kong. Where were you when Hong Kong was a British colony? Where were you with democracy in Hong Kong? Didn't say a word. The moment it went back to China, you started saying, oh, democracy in Hong Kong. It's classic imperialist thinking. Be careful. Don't fall into those traps. When it was a colony, you were perfectly happy. Oh, stiff upper lip and gin and tonic in a summer evening in the tropics. No, that's not the right attitude. It used to be a colony. Now it has reverted back to China. And the Chinese actually have quite generously said, one country, two systems. They didn't need to do that. They could have just done what Jawaharlal Nehru did to Goa. Nehru sent the military into Goa, ejected the Portuguese by force, and brought Goa right into India. Chinese didn't do that. They waited till the lease ran out. Nehru didn't wait for anything. He just sent the military in the 1960s and seized Goa. No criticism from anybody because Nehru was seen as a liberal. That's the difference. It's about politics, not about actions, by the way. It's often about politics. So yeah, Brian, we consider the global north led by the United States to be a decadent and dangerous threat to the planet. Dangerous because it has demonstrated it is willing to destroy the world in order to maintain its hegemony. Trump used the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. US government is the only government in the world to drop atom bombs on the planet. That was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And now they are planning to place mid-range nuclear missiles in Latvia or Estonia. There's a discussion about that. The Germans are building a base that will afford that. United States wants to place nuclear weapons in Darwin, in northern Australia, in violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga. There are no Chinese naval bases or military bases in Cuba. That's just not there. It doesn't exist. In that sense, the US and its bloc is very dangerous, but also decadent. Decadent because the leaders of the West, Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, they don't have any ideas. They are idealists. They are decadent. They are sort of coasting on yesterday, constantly talking about how great the United States is. How great can it be if it can't produce high-speed rail? If you're continuing to produce military armaments more than you produce joy for the world's population. Dropping a bomb on a country is not bringing democracy to anybody. So that's why we consider it decadent. The US political class cannot come up with a good candidate that people can respect around the world. I mean, constantly shovels mediocre people in the face of the world and says, this is your leader, salute them. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah, and I do want to get to audience questions, but before I do, I'd like to connect these two issues if possible. But first, one of the worst examples, I think, of the decadence of the Western countries, the countries that once colonized almost all of the countries in the world, is this belief in their own exceptionalism. We see that in American exceptionalism. And it's held up as almost a civic religion in this country. But essentially what it means is that the rules that we expect to apply on the rest of the world should not apply to us. For example, you were discussing Taiwan. How would we react if the Chinese Navy consistently sailed its warships between Cuba and Florida in the Straits of Florida? That's something that we consistently do as a show of force in the Straits of Taiwan. So different rules, international rules and norms that apply to other countries, but don't apply to us. But I do want to try and connect these two issues of hyper-imperialism and authoritarianism, and we will get to your questions. But how do you see the two as feeding each other? How do you see countries that are the victims of US imperialism reacting? And sometimes because of sanctions, because of the threat of direct intervention, countries becoming more strict on their own populations. Sometimes rightly so, sometimes not. But how do you see these two feeding each other, both abroad and here in the US?
I mean, this is a struggle. Let's not be naive about it. It's a genuine struggle. If you take the case of Russia, the Soviet Union had its own problems, but the way that the Soviets, how the Soviet Union was basically killed off by a set of people who were leading the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and then how Yeltsin and company came in and sold off the country. I mean, I know now Jeffrey Sachs is a great critic of US power, but Jeffrey was an advisor to the new Russian government. And basically, the United States created the oligarchs. The United States created Putin. Putin was selected as the safe replacement for Yeltsin so that Yeltsin wouldn't be prosecuted. It was the US that lifted him up, that propped him up. And then Putin turned around and said that you've destroyed my country. We're going to lift it to its former glory. Russian nationalism that emerged from Putin was not a reaction to the Soviet Union, or it's not about Putin's character or anything like that. It's a reaction to what was done to Russia quite deliberately by the West. Sort of walking all over Russian dignity. And then you had Putin reacting to that. I mean, all of Putin's political formations have been exceedingly nationalistic because they are a reaction directly to the humiliations of the 1990s when Russia lost people in Russia lost over a decade of life expectancy in the manner of just a few years. What happened to the Soviet Union is a crime, and nobody has discussed that. We don't talk about it. What was done to the people of the USSR. I mean, I had friends who were college professors and so on. They were selling clothes on the street. They used to fly to India on very cheap tickets to buy clothes in the second-hand Indian market, fly them back to Russia, sell clothes on the street because they weren't getting their salary. Do you know why they were not getting their salaries? Because George Soros did a bet against the ruble and made $1 billion. So this whole financing of liberalism in the West through the Open Society Foundation, that was funded by stealing the salaries of state employees in what used to be the Soviet Union. So I don't have any patience for these Soros-type liberals. Even Jeffrey Sachs, I mean, I feel unless you give an accounting of what you have done, it's very hard to take you seriously as a major critic of that situation now. What about the kind of horrible situation? So, when people say, oh, in Russia, there are oligarchs. No, these are not Russian-made oligarchs. These are US-made oligarchs. Let's be clear about them. And now that Putin is cracking down on them, the United States is defending their old friends who are oligarchs and calling Putin an authoritarian. What is Putin's authoritarianism? He's cracking down at big businessmen. Don't you wish that your government would tax and crack down on your billionaires like that disgusting Peter Thiel, who needs to realize all he did was start a stupid software company? There's nothing that is done that warrants his comments in the public sphere. Or Elon Musk, a child of apartheid South Africa. I mean, when the Xi Jinping started taking back, control of the economy in the state's hands, they cracked down on the oligarchs in China. They told Jack Ma, you can't, you can't advise us. We don't want your advice. You go for a retreat and go and read the works of Mao Zedong and think about the society you're living in, and then you can come back and run Ant. But for now, take a sabbatical. That's what they told Jack Ma. And by the way, in the West, they said, well, Jack Ma has been killed. He wasn't killed. He was sent to a retreat. Some of you go for Buddhist retreats. He went to a Maoist retreat. What's the difference?
Well, I know Mary is desperately trying to get in here. I'm going to add her up on the screen. You want to get to the audience, but I want to invite you to ask any question that you have and have the first bite at the apple if you'd like.
Well, I actually don't have a question, but I will say thank you for your remarks about Jeffrey Sachs, for whom I worked for 8 years. And he used to ask me if he should go to these places and advise because he knew I was a leftist. And I would say, well, if you want to go to Bolivia and work for one of the worst dictators in the world, he said, well, I think I will. So, no, I'm very glad that he's taking the role he has now, but I believe that some of the greatest heroes I have are people who've shown their ability to change.
People can change.
But let's have some accountability too. I wish he'd explain, but that's neither here nor there. I do want to suggest to people that they can subscribe to the Tricontinental newsletter, and I've put it in the chat. And I've also put several articles on. And yes, the Tricontinental Institute is the revival of Tricontinental of Cuba. And yes, it is with full permission and cooperation from Cuba on that. And I'm delighted that it is back in service with its and Tricontinental, if you go and look, it is really on all of the continents. It has offices, it has important thinkers, it has important writers, it has interesting perspectives, and I really recommend people that they subscribe to the newsletter. But we're going to get to questions. But before we do, I also want to say, in case you drop off ahead of time, that we have actions that we would like you to take. One is subscribing to the newsletter. The other is to take action on the war in Gaza. Well, you are, most of you are, but we have some additional actions to recommend, and also to take action calling for ceasefire in Ukraine. We cannot forget Ukraine. There are people dying there in the hundreds of thousands. And then as soon as we send you the link and the information, we hope you will register for the Chicago Convention in the Streets with Ryan Garvey, Keith Harvey, and any of you who are in Chicago will want to hear what you have to say too. But now to questions. And I wrote down who had their hands raised, and I'm going to do it in order. Jeffrey Bartel was first, then Yuri Smelter, and then I saw Harris Grumman's hand, but I don't see it anymore. So we'll go to whatever hand is next.
It's Bartel first off.
Well,
And
I apologize.
Sorry. And Yvonne, is that it? Is that your name?
Vijay.
It's Vijay.
Vijay, sorry. I don't have much time because I gotta jump off to another meeting, so I gotta make this quick. First off, you said there should be a different word for the, instead of authoritarianism or fascism. How about a word called democracide? And if you could share your contact with me in the chat box, then I can talk more with you about democracy and a couple of ideas I have to fix democracy. Would you like that?
The easiest way to reach me is at the website that's there in the chat already, the Tricontinental. Just write to me at the website. My contact is on the site. So that's easy enough. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Vijay.
All right.
You're muted, Mary.
And don't forget your promise about the chat in the transcript.
Absolutely. We'll be sending that out. And just to let people know, don't scramble to find all the links either, because we'll be sending those out in a follow-up too. And please forward that on to all your friends and family. It'll include the recording of this program.
It is our custom, as well as I believe our duty, to send out a follow-up to everybody who's registered, as well as those who have attended, with the recording, notes, links, and the actions that you can take. So next I want to go to Yuri Smelter. And Harris, do you still have a question? Because you'll be next. Good. And then Ann Batista.
Okay. First of all, thank you. And thank you also for pronouncing my last name correctly. Not many people get that, so I appreciate that.
Well, 1 out of 2 is not bad.
So many questions, but I want to be respectful of other people. But 3 very quick questions to Mr. Prashad, which is, do you think it's long overdue that the West and arguably the global left move beyond its anti-communist leftism? Because so that's my first one. And regarding Trump and Trump as this, symbol of authoritarianism and so forth, I completely agree with what you were saying about the Democratic Party and so forth. But that being said, I do think that there's become a tendency amongst the best of the left to sort of downplay Trump's very authoritarianism and not take seriously the fact that he is very reactionary, and if he has a political comeback, it will be I mean, it won't be the end of the world, but the world will not be in a very good shape. So, do you think that people power movements should hold their nose and vote for the Democrats just to keep the Republicans at bay from having another major comeback? But that being said, the people power movements mobilize like hell against the austerity agenda, imperialism agenda of a Kamala Harris, the way that Yasser Louazi, in France, that's how he basically was suggesting that the French electorate and the French left respond to, Le Pen. So hold your nose, vote for Macron to get Le Pen out of power, but then mobilize like hell against his, austerity agenda and so forth.
Well, firstly, I don't live in the United States, so I don't want to give advice because that would be foreign intervention. And I believe that foreign intervention is something that creates problems in the US election system because the United States, as you know, never interferes in other people's elections, least of all in Venezuela right now, where they said that we respect the Venezuelan process, Venezuelan Supreme Court, and so on. So I don't want to interfere. On the other hand, I would like to say that if I were you, which is different from interfering, if I could masquerade as you, which again is a problem because the United States has a problem, I'm told, of dead people coming in to vote, or at least that's what the Republicans say happens, particularly among Democratic voters. They claim that most Democratic voters are dead, which is an interesting statement, perhaps a statement of fact, but I'm not going to get into that either. My own feeling is, this is a ridiculous discussion to have in a state like if you're living in Massachusetts or places like that. I mean, I would honestly spend my time trying to build an alternative. And the reason, for instance, Jill Stein entered the race again wasn't because Jill wanted to run for president. She had done it before. She did it in order to protect the Green Party's ballot line and to try to build the infrastructure of the Green Party. That was what Cornel West was supposed to do, and to expand the Green Party's role. Look, in France, people used to say, you just vote for Macron, as you said, to keep out Le Pen. It ended up people voted for the United Front of the left. Leading force was La France Insoumise that got more seats than Macron. The Communist Party, La France Insoumise, the Green Movement, the Movement of Elders, and so on. That alliance did better than Macron. And Macron had to face the fact about that. And that's a reality. So my feeling is, you got to have the courage in the United States to build an alternative, because there is no way the Democratic Party, ever since the Democratic Leadership Council did a coup d'etat by Bill Clinton and Joe Lieberman and other people, ever since then, the Democratic Party hasn't been the broad alliance that it used to be, an alliance of trade unions and civil rights groups and so on. I mean, just look at the way they allowed Joe Biden to go so long into the process, then removed him, then prevented an open convention, then installed Kamala Harris through a kind of almost a regal process, and then held a convention which was an advertisement campaign where you had horrendous figures from the past come and terrorize you, including the Clintons. I mean, the Clintons endorsing anybody should be a clear sign that there's something wrong here. Both Bill and Hillary together. They imagine the destruction they have put on the planet. Hillary Clinton, that little ad that they did with, AOC completely compromised, where they go clap, clap like this, clap, clap like this, starts with Hillary Clinton, made me want to retch. Hillary Clinton, the destroyer of Libya, a country where I first went in 1974, which was such a beautiful place. I was there last about 4 years ago, a complete wreck. It's dangerous to go anywhere. A country that used to be completely safe, dangerous to go anywhere. People carrying heavy machine guns and so on. That's on Hillary Clinton. She was laughing when Gaddafi was sodomized and killed. That's a homophobic reaction, her reaction. We came, we saw, he died. Ha, ha. How is that even morally acceptable to liberals? That's that. And so you have to decide, do we build an alternative? Do we have the courage to do it? Or are we continuing once again, as you have for decades and decades and decades, of saying, my God, the alternative is so bad, better go back home to the fuzzy old Democrats, even though this is Joe Lieberman's party and not even the party of, the old Ohio Democrats and so on. I mean, this is the political party that has not only been complicit in what the Israelis have done in Gaza, but in fact have armed them. In the last period, over $1 billion of heavy bombs provided by this liberal government to the Israelis to drop on schools. Al-Tabayin school bombed at 4 a.m. in the morning, 100 people killed. I mean, how is this a better alternative? You got to look for another road. You got to have the courage to build another road. But I'm not interfering in the election.
Well, I'll just quickly say, here's hoping that Trump doesn't win and have a comeback, and that people do mobilize like hell against the Democrats. But I completely agree with you that I do think it's long overdue that people support the Greens, Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I definitely endorse what Daruba was saying on Black Liberation Media about having a united front against fascism, but that also means against the Democrats. So, yeah.
Thanks, Yuri.
Oh, great. So Harris Ruben did have his hand up and would be next. But if he's no longer here, or we can come back to him, then Ann Batista is next, and then Zarina Memon.
Hi, thank you so much, Vijay, for talking to us today. I put a question in the chat about the control of information infrastructure that I think is the hallmark of authoritarianism. And, Zuckerberg released a letter just, a day or two ago, and in which he admitted that the FBI approached him to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story from the New York Post just before the 2020 election. I'll read a quote from his letter. He said, "It's since been," and he mentioned actually that it had allegations of Biden family corruption with Burisma. And I'll quote from the letter. He said, "It's since been made clear that the reporting was not Russian disinformation, and in retrospect, we shouldn't have demoted the story." Now, to me, this is, of course, anybody who's been paying attention knows this is just the tip of the iceberg. I agree with your comments about liberalism. The Democratic Party, along with the Republican Party, along with elites across the world, witness France's arresting Pavel Durov. All people, the West, it seems, wants to completely silence independent voices and just and to control our cognitive infrastructure. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, frankly, the first thing is the hardware question. And I mentioned that already. There are roughly 4,500 satellites in orbit. And it's interesting that of them, China owns 467. Elon Musk's company owns 1,655. I mean, people are all terrified about Chinese interference. Elon Musk owns more than 3 times the Chinese satellites. You're all worried about the Chinese are going to spy on my phones. Meanwhile, Edward Snowden has released a PowerPoint presentation which shows how the NSA already spies on people who use various technologies sold by US companies. And even worse, you've got to go out there and read the book by what's his name from Google, Eric Schmidt, Eric Schmidt's own book, he has a chapter in his own book on his life at Google, where he talks about how he worked together with the U.S. security services. I mean, this is Schmidt writing in a popular mainstream book, absolutely unfazed, happy to share this information. It's interesting. This war on terror provided the U.S. government with expansion powers that were unbelievable. I mean, they can search anything, look at anything, the hidden warrants, the warrantless wiretaps, things like that. And yet, people in the United States, knowing all that, worry about authoritarianism elsewhere. This is the extraordinary, mental dislocation. I mean, you guys all know about warrantless wiretaps, but some of you probably still think that Putin or Xi Jinping are more dangerous than the US government. That I find extraordinary. And also, I'm sorry to say, deeply parochial, because in the end of the day, you have faith in a US president or a US leader. It might also be a little racist. Sorry to say that again, that there's an assumption, a mostly Caucasian government is got some ounce of liberalism bred into it, whereas a Chinese government is kind of ontologically dangerous. I don't know. I'm speculating. I think largely there is a dislocation in what we're thinking. I mean, the evidence is already there. The US government says if you have a Huawei phone, the Chinese might spy on you. But Edward Snowden has already told us, and Eric Schmidt has already told us, the US government already spies on you. So you're worried about what the Chinese might do. That's the words of the US government. But you're not worried about what the US government is doing. In fact, some people, in the name of security, want the government to spy on them more. They say, let's have more cameras, more police, more this, more that. So, let's have a little introspection for a minute. What I find extraordinary is when I meet people in the US who have such strong opinions about China, but they know nothing about China. They know nothing, which is why our institute decided to publish a journal called Wenhua Zhongheng. It's freely available online. This journal brings together voices and debates from Chinese academics whose voices one never hears. Now, I will admit that the Great Wall of Mandarin is impressive. I mean, the Chinese were not fully colonized by the English, so they don't speak English. They were not colonized by the Spanish. They speak Mandarin. They speak a language that emerged out of their history, and that's the Great Wall of Mandarin. So it's very hard to get the debates in China. So I'm sympathetic to the difficulty, but people don't seem to make an effort. They just have some yellow peril idea from the 19th century. The Chinese are coming to get us. The old yellow peril idea. The yellows are migrating to California and they're going to take our jobs away. Combine yellow peril with the red scare. And my God, if you mix yellow and red, what do you get? You get orange, which is the color of Donald Trump. Good God, my mind is exploding.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative because I think Anne's question is incredibly important, and I want to ask you another aspect of this. You may have seen the recent Supreme Court decision, which has now legalized and declared constitutional the kind of FBI and government interference and intimidation towards social media companies that Anne was just talking about. That was a 6-3 decision that overturned the original and appellate court that found that kind of behavior a gross violation of the First Amendment by the Biden administration. But according to the Supreme Court, all of the liberals and moderates on it in a 6-3 decision, and one of the most important cases since Bantam Books has now declared, because of the threat of foreign interference and misinformation, that kind of interference and intimidation of social media companies is now constitutional. How do you think that's going to affect the discourse in the United States?
I mean, do you really need an answer to that? I mean, there's a law in India which is a law that is supposed to protect you from cyberbullying. Yeah. So the intent was very good, to protect people from cyberbullying, particularly children and so on. The law is basically used by the government to silence dissent. If I send a tweet out saying that the chief minister of West Bengal is murderous, there will be, there'll be police at my door arresting me because I've tried to bully the chief minister. I mean, this is a very, very interesting scenario we are in now, where, of course, we want protections against bullying online. But what's the difference between a bullying speech and challenging an elected public official online? Should there be latitude? Well, apparently not. Apparently, if you send it, an academic at a small university in Calcutta in India tweeted somebody else's cartoon about the prime minister and he was arrested. You just get a sense of what is this free speech and who gets to define it. But also, I want us to acknowledge the difficulty of building these kinds of laws. Like, do you really want to have the law be by itself, or should there be some latitude and maybe a citizens panel, neighborhood groups get involved? I mean, are there other ways to provide justice than an abstract law and the police? Is there a way for neighborhood groups to have a meeting, to have a conversation? What did you intend with that, and so on? I just think we end up wanting to execute people very quickly, whether it's from the left or the right, because it is true, we all abhor bullying. But look, the state can so easily say, I'm being bullied by you. You go to jail. That's exactly how the anti-bullying law, cyberbullying law was used in India.
And can I just answer for a minute? I think that our First Amendment that abridges any governmental interference with freedom of speech is probably the most fundamental source of democracy, if we can reestablish it, or if we ever had it. And I think that all of these efforts to censor speech are ultimately, as Vijay just described, they're going to be used to silence dissent. And I think that we have to get away from even considering that we need to silence social media, that social media is a negative thing. No, it's actually, it allows the voice of the people to be heard, and it allows dissent to be heard. And we need to make sure that we protect that. And I think that one of the things that the West right now is trying very desperately to do is to shut down social media around the world.
May I ask, Vijay, can we go till 8:30?
You know what would be best is if we had the next three questions in a bunch.
That's what I was
going to answer them all. Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's
and
good.
Before that, I want to say that I don't know that I can pronounce it correctly, but I put the link to Wenhazong Heng in the chat because when that started, I thought this is really, really important because we have no idea what leftists and academics and thinkers in China are saying and writing. The last book I read on that subject was in following 1989.
Yeah.
And it turns out there's a wide diversity of thought, and we have no idea. So that's really important, and I thank you for publishing that, and I hope we can all read it. So there are three more questions. Zarina Memon, followed by Judith Elliott, followed by Andrew McLeod.
Okay, so let's go to Zarina first. You just unmute yourself and go ahead with your question.
Here we go. So I have, first of all, I've written down a couple of thoughts here. One is, can you think of historically any way that hyper-imperialism has been controlled? Because I'm sure it has been with the feudal societies in the past. Also, is a global democratic system a better form of discussion because the world's being more homogeneous? Also, I feel that Putin and the Z government have more less government dissent, you can say, to from the people. So I'm not just sure if I agree with they're better, but America's got definitely problems, especially with the Citizens United and the amount of hours it works and so forth. And lastly, I want to say Libya, Gaddafi's problem were a problem that the citizens pointed out when I was a student at Northeastern. So I think our intervention was complicated. That's my thought.
Okay, do we want to go to
So
Judith next?
then to Judith.
Yeah, you just unmute yourself and go ahead with your question, Judith.
Thank you for being here, Vijay. I was wondering if you'd comment on the Israeli targeting of journalists. I think the number is about 170 now, journalists killed, and also the arrest of so many, journalists recently not allowed to enter into Germany, and Richard Medhurst by those 6 police officers. It's really concerning.
And thank you. And then finally, Andrew McLeod. And then, Vijay, you can try to answer all 3 of those questions.
Okay, go ahead, Andrew, and good luck,
Yes,
Vijay.
good evening, and thank you for doing this. I am concerned about what Anne was referring to, the threats to freedom of speech and press in liberal democracies. We have in the House of Representatives, the vast majority of them voted to affirm that criticism of Zionism is equivalent to anti-Semitism. And there's an attempt to ban TikTok. EU officials have threatened legal action against Elon Musk, the arrest of the owner of Telegram. In Germany, the Palestinian flag is outlawed and pro-Palestinian activists are threatened with arrest. And then in Scotland and in Canada, we see a legislation enact equivocating certain speech with violent acts and thus illegal. Thank you for your commentary.
Did you get all that, Vijay?
Yeah. Sorry. My internet is, it's
I was joking. It's a tough task. We've just
no.
given you.
It's just the internet is fuzzy. Let's go. I mean, I'm not going to obviously be able to get to everything, but luckily Judith and Andrew were in the same area of talking about free speech, journalism, and so on. But to Zarina's point about China and the United States, very interesting. I've been looking into this. How does one calibrate democracy, let's say? So let's take one thing as an example. I have about 5 indicators I looked at from 2023, but let's take one indicator, which is strikes. I think it's a pretty good indicator. So a major work stoppage in the United States in 2023 was 33 major work stoppages. Now, this, is not all some workers upset about this, that, and the other, but this is a major work stoppage, 33. In China, it was 1,800 in the same year. So now, obviously, China has about 4 times the population of the United States. If you multiply 33 by 4, you get about 130. It's still about 1/10 of the number of work stoppages in China, major work stoppages, which are 1,800 in China. Now, what happens to these work stoppages in China? Interestingly, if you go back and you look at even critics of the Chinese government, there are more strike days in China than in most Western democracies. That means that workers are striking more in China than they are in other countries. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you say that, well, then the conditions of work must be bad, therefore they are striking, then it's a bad thing. Then conditions of work are bad in China. On the other hand, if you say that, are you trying to say conditions of work are good in the United States? That's why people are not striking. Or are you saying that workers are more organized in China? Now, it's also true that the Chinese trade unions generally are state-approved unions. But in the United States, trade unions are ... state-approved, because they have to go through a process with the NLRB, which is it's a legal process within the state. It's not like you have non-state actors in the union movement in the US either. Most countries, trade unions are state approved because you have to go through a process of registering. You can be denied the right to have your union be formed. So they have an active and vibrant union movement in China. When I was there last time, I met with people from the green movement, from the various environmental movements. They constantly have actions there. Now, the interesting issue is the only time you see reporting on any of this is when the report is about how the Chinese government has failed. What you don't see is 3,000 people protesting in Nanshan saying that you're building this green city, but it's only going to be for 5 million people. What about the rest of us? We want green cities like Nanshan. That protest is not reported in the New York Times because actually that story would look good in the US because they are building a 5 million people city, which is 100% carbon neutral outside Beijing. People would read that and go, oh my God, I want to live in that city. So it's not like China has no public demonstrations. During COVID, there were demonstrations all the time of different kinds, people calling for things, asking for things, and so on. So, I mean, one mustn't underestimate the kind of public action you see in China. I don't know Russia very well. Haven't been to Russia since, the so-called old days. Enough said. But I have been to China several times a year, in fact. And I do get to interact with a range of different forces, and I'm impressed by the kind of society they are building. In fact, more vigorous democracy than India, where democratic rights are being eroded daily, much more. Although they don't have liberal democratic elections with a competing multi-party system and so on. They don't have that, nor does Cuba. But people don't seem to have the same attitude towards Cuba as they have of China. There is a kind of romance of Fidel Castro, which is not there of China. And, that's all good to me. Please continue to romanticize Cuba a little bit. Cuba needs all the solidarity it can get. I'm not trying to be critical of that. And finally, on the question of journalists, in my opinion, this crackdown is extremely dangerous. And, we need to be very vigilant and aware of it. The killing of journalists in Gaza is an enormous crime, just as the killing of doctors, destruction of hospitals, bombing of schools, and so on, institutions that made up Palestinian society. I was last in Gaza in 2014 after that bombing. I wondered, how are they going to rebuild? The bombing was so destructive just in a short period. This is, of course, at a magnitude that's unimaginable. Universities destroyed, and yes, not only journalists killed, Judith, but the families of journalists targeted. A mafia attitude towards journalists. The great Al Jazeera journalist family was targeted. His wife, his children bombed in their home. I've lost 4 friends who were journalists who I knew when I was in Gaza. They were targeted because their bombs fell directly on their homes, didn't fall on the street, and they were killed on the street. Their homes were. Why did the Israelis, who claim pinpoint accuracy, bomb the house of a journalist? I mean, if you're trying to kill the journalist, you have pinpoint accuracy, the bomb falls on the house of the journalist. You can't have it both ways. You can't say that was accidental and we have pinpoint accuracy in our bombing. You can't have it both ways. Then you're just bombing randomly and killing random people. That makes the genocide case against you even firmer. So if you have pinpoint accuracy, which is what the Israelis said at the International Court of Justice, they said, we are not conducting genocide, we are going after Hamas, pinpoint accuracy, then why are you bombing the homes of so many journalists? A grievous crime, and Israel will pay the price for that crime. When it comes to journalists being arrested and so on, this is hardly new. I mean, this is a fact of our existence. I've been deported from 3 countries. That's just the nature of this kind of profession. I was very happy when the New York Times ran an article and accused me of being a paid agent of China. I thought, well, that's high praise coming from the garbage in the New York Times. If they write that, it has to be untrue. Obviously, that made it difficult for me to live my life because I lost bank accounts and things like that. Banks wouldn't allow us to bank there because they said, well, we have a risk because you may be a foreign agent paid by the Chinese government. In fact, I wouldn't say no if the Chinese said we would like to fund this project. Unfortunately, the Chinese are not in the business of funding projects like this. But the US government still believes that, and it's chilling because what happens is they put this word out, it gets out there in social media, and then people say, oh, these people aren't a reputable source because they are agents of the Chinese government, or these people are Russian agents and so on. I mean, what about half or more than half of the US Congress who are paid agents of the Israeli government? What about that? I mean, these people have no shame pointing fingers where there's not even smoke, forget a fire. But from them, it's a bonfire. It's a bonfire, to borrow from that horrible man. It's a bonfire of their vanities, their vanity to continue being in office regardless of the moral compromise that they have to put up with. I mean, some of these people were probably decent people when they went into Congress. I mean, now look at AOC making absolute cover for Kamala Harris, saying, oh, she's trying day and night to do a ceasefire. What ceasefire? They continue to sell arms to the Israelis, to kill children, to bomb schools, and so on. What ceasefire? No ceasefire at all from this administration. And there's AOC, probably a sincere, decent person when she went into Congress. And now look at that. It's an absolute compromise of your morality, of your moral fiber. And we all compromise a little bit. None of us is perfect. But there's a big difference between compromising a little bit, which we all do, and absolutely, getting into the jacuzzi with the arms dealers. I don't want to put my toes with the arms dealers into their jacuzzi. Thanks a lot. That's not going to happen. However much you pay me. My aunt once asked me when I was quite young, she said, son, what's your price? How much would you take to sell out your principles? I haven't seen the price yet, but it's certainly not a junket with some arms dealers. That's not enough. I need more to sell out, much, much more. And I hope that all of you, and know that all of you would sell out for nothing, because your integrity is much more important than whatever they dangle in front of you. I know many of you personally, extremely upstanding people, and I'm proud to call many of you my friends, and I wish you well, with all the struggles that you are conducting. This very difficult time in election time, because this whole thing, the trapdoor shuts on your possibilities, because people say, gather around the Democrats to protect civil liberties and so on. So I really do wish you well. And I hope that there's some daylight left after November the 5th.
And let me just give you a laugh. Let me just give you a laugh on your way out the door, Vijay. That New York Times article that you referenced about you being an agent of the Chinese government, even I was called for comment, and I'm being serious. So they went far and wide in search of evidence of you being a foreign agent. I didn't know.
I'm jealous. No, I'm jealous. They didn't call me.
How many calls do you think they made if they got to me? It's pretty extreme. But go on, Mary.
They had about 20 people working on the story. Okay.
Oh my goodness! It took that many.
Yeah. And the first question that they sent me in the questionnaire, the first question was, "Do you work for the Chinese government?" And I thought, this is not journalism. This is a congressional inquiry. And the only congressperson who asked for a formal Justice Department investigation was little Marco.
Oh, kidding. Well, he would. He would. So people asked how to contact Vijay, and the way to contact him is through the Tricontinental website. And you've actually received this several times now. And but if you subscribe to the Tricontinental newsletter, you'll just be amazed at everything you hear from Vijay. Right? And not just Vijay, but Vijay, before we go, could you just say what countries the Tricontinental is in?
Yeah, plug your work.
Well, we are based in India, South Africa, Zambia, Ghana, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, Chile, a few other places I can't remember. Yeah.
See, now this is really important because you can get out of the bubble that we're in and hear from voices across the globe and voices that have not drunk the Kool-Aid, that are not being investigated. Well, no, they're being investigated by the New York Times. But really, you can get out of the bubble and you can find information from reliable sources that can help you break out of that Eurocentric mindset that we get locked into and see what the rest of the world is thinking and saying. So, Vijay and Brian, thank you so much for this. This has been so worthwhile.
Yeah, we appreciate your time, Vijay. Thank you.
Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye.
Have a great night. Bye.